Imagine part of the early United States left unclaimed. Its residents countryless, having to survive completely on their own. Not by some accident or bureaucratic mix-up, but by an international agreement. Never happened, you say? Think again.
The following program is brought to you by America's Byways, Gateways to Adventure, where no two experiences are the same. The National Scenic Byways program invites you to come closer to America's heart. By the Louisiana Office of Tourism, Louisiana, Feed Your Soul. And by Louisiana's Myths and Legends Byway.
Barely 20 years a nation, the United States of America in 1803 negotiated one of the greatest land deals in the history of civilization by purchasing the Louisiana territories from France. But lost in nearly every historical account is the fact the deal did not go down without dispute.
The western boundary was pretty much undefined. Thomas Jefferson believed that the United States had bought all the way to the Rio Grande. Spain was not amenable to that.
The Spanish believed the border extended much further east into present-day Louisiana.
And so in 1806, they send a fairly large force across the Sabine River.
The United States responded by calling troops and militia to repulse the perceived Spanish threat. This tension was the result of decades of posturing between colonial empires in the New World over a neutral strip of land that for one reason after another had defied jurisdiction. Now, two international powers stood face to face, ready to defend their interest. A storied land of pirates and contraband, outlaws and lawlessness that bred a culture of fierce independence and self-reliance that still exists and is celebrated to this day. A precursor of what was to become the Wild West and one of the most unique and little-known international border disputes in North American history. The last piece of the puzzle in the 18th state, becoming Louisiana. In the early 1700s, France was claiming all the lands drained by the Mississippi River. Spain was claiming the territory west of that. The British colonies were a world away. France made the first move in settling their claim by sending Louis Saint-Denis to establish trade with the Natchitoches Indians in 1716.
So they were both looking to control the interior of North America, and they kind of come and meet really for the first time right here at Natchitoches and Los Adias.
The purpose of Los Adias was really to protect the Spanish interest and to keep the French from moving into Spanish territory.
With no accurate maps and few distinguishing geographic features, the generally accepted boundary between the colonial empires was the Rio Hondo and Calcasieu rivers. And there is another empire of native peoples to contend with.
That does set it apart from other places because you had a very benevolent Caddo confederation here that in a sense welcomed both the Spanish and the French. The Spanish were looking to convert them to Catholicism. The French were just happy to trade with them.
Spain further secured its border by extending the Royal Road, the El Camino Real from Mexico City, and making Los Adias the capital of Spanish Texas in 1729. Then things changed. In 1762, France ceded the Louisiana territory west of the Mississippi and New Orleans to Spain, its territory east of the Mississippi to Britain. lands that had been French became Spanish. Even the French Fort Saint Jean-Baptiste in Natchitoches. With no border to protect, Los Adias was abandoned in 1773, and the soldiers sent back to San Antonio. But their story does not end there, because their lives had become deeply intertwined with the land and the people of the neutral strip.
All those soldiers who were here are intermingled with our genealogy.
Rhonda Goche descends from one such soldier, Gil Ibarbo.
Il Ibarbo was the son of Mateo Ibarbo. Mateo was stationed here at Los Adias. Il Ibarbo, he was born here in 1729, and that's actually one of my grandfathers.
The political situation in Europe changed yet again, and in 1800, Spain ceded the Louisiana territory back to France. And before the borders between the two empires could be reestablished, in 1803, the United States purchases the Louisiana territory from France.
Spain was still claiming part of what is now Louisiana, because the boundaries of Spanish Texas was at Robeline.
When the United States bought that land from France, they didn't really know exactly where that western boundary was south of Natchitoches, 32nd parallel.
I think the U.S. was a little bit reluctant to get into a war or get into a struggle with Spain over going ahead and pushing them back to the Sabine or even farther.
The United States was represented by General James Wilkinson, the Spanish by Simón de Herrera. As Wilkinson pushes his troops further west, he decides he does not want to fight.
And so what Wilkinson proposes is that we'll move back east of the Rio Hondo, which is a boundary that went back all the way to the founding of Natchitoches and Los Adias. This was a historic boundary between the two, between the French and the Spanish.
And the Spanish were to stay west of the Sabine River, according to Wilkinson's proposal.
And they made a gentleman's agreement, literally saying, for the time being, we will not send anyone to protect, to tax, or to control the inhabitants of this area, this strip between what we view as our territory and what we view as your territory. It's sort of this dissolved neutral strip. And the way we're going to deal with it is just not bother with the people who are living there.
And in 1806, with this gentleman's agreement, no man's land was born. And until such time that diplomats could work out the details, there would be no new settlers, no government assistance, and no law.
The quirkiness of the no man's land thing is essentially government making claims to things they had never explored and did not thoroughly understand.
Once those boundaries were specifically drawn out through a treaty by Simón de Herrera and General James Wilkinson, then you have a real line where people are realizing there's an opportunity there.
Hello and welcome into the LPB studios on a very exciting night. I'm Chuck Perrin, longtime volunteer and friend of LPB. You're watching the premiere of the documentary No Man's Land. We are going to meet one of the filmmakers, Ulmer-Rodman, in just a moment. But first, it is during this brief intermission that we invite you to help LPB continue to tell Louisiana's story as only LPB can do. Think about all the intriguing stories you've seen here, like the one tonight. And from No Man's Land, and we have the spirit of a culture, Cane River Creoles, to deeply rooted Atchafalaya houseboat, and Attakapaw, the Cajun story. Boy, they're great, only on LPB. It's viewers' contributions like yours that made this possible. So here's your chance to make a difference and help us continue this tradition of sharing the culture of our great state. Simply call or text GIVE to 888-769-5000 or become a member of LPB online at lpb.org or you can scan that QR code, that funny looking thing you see on your screen. Do it with your camera in your smart device and it's going to hook you up. And consider becoming a sustaining member with easy monthly donations. Now, I would like to tell you about the thank you gifts that we have for your pledge of support during this broadcast, and they are quite impressive. If you choose to pledge $240, that's just $20 a month, you're going to receive the No Man's Land combo, which includes the Marshes to Mansions hardcover book and a pair of LPB gumbo mugs, the Natchitoches and Louisiana's Timeless Cane River hardcover book by Philip Gould, and the program DVD, just $20 a month. If you want to go a little less, $120, you'll receive the Natchitoches and Louisiana's Timeless Cane River hardcover book by Philip Gould. That's just $10 a month. Or for $6 a month, you can receive the program DVD. We also have some credit card specials. A $400 special credit card offer. For a pledge of $400 or more on a credit card, you will receive an original pelican painting by local Lake Charles artist Eddie Moorman. This is an 8x10. It's really, really terrific. For $1,200 on a special credit card offer, the first caller of $1,200 or more on a credit card, you're going to receive a 2-night stay, including a complimentary guided fishing trip for 2, along with a round of golf, green fees, and card included. Sign me up for this. Oh, I can't do it. Sorry, it's open to you, not me. And so in addition to these wonderful gifts, you're going to receive Visions, LPB's monthly program guide, Louisiana Life magazine, and our popular member benefit, LPB Passport. You can't miss out on that. And seated right next to me is a man I'm glad Louisiana has not missed out on. This is Mr. Bill Rodman. Bill is the guy who did the show that we're watching, along with his wife. Got to give her credit too. But you know, Bill, he really has cut his teeth in TV, going back to television newsrooms in Wyoming and Louisiana back in the 1990s. Here in Louisiana, he won a couple of Suncoast Emmy Awards. He was a Reporter of the Year with Associated Press and a finalist in the large market NAPTE Iris Award. That's pretty impressive. That's showcasing the best locally produced programs in the English-speaking world. Well, I don't know if we're the English-speaking world because we got some French accents and you got some Cane River folks with some accents. But anyway, this is Mr. Bill Rodman. Bill is the fella who did the documentary we're watching. Fantastic.
Pleasure to be here, Chuck.
Oh, I can't tell you how glad I am you did this because I have so many friends. I'm a history buff. When I tell them we used to have a town in Louisiana, it was the capital of Texas, they say, you know a lot, but you're wrong on this one. You're proving me right.
You know, this story is so interesting on so many levels, Chuck, and to think that this was a dispute that arose from the Louisiana Purchase. That is not the usual narrative that we hear about the Louisiana Purchase, and just on so many levels. That left the earliest settlers there governmentless. There was no law and order in terms of international identity. They had none. Beyond that opened the door to outlaws and pirates and.
But Bill, this is a story nobody really knows.
Nobody knows about this, and I talk with a lot of people about it since we've been producing it and while we were working on it, and people say, you know, that ought to be part of Louisiana history curriculum.
Absolutely.
And so it's just been an absolute honor to be able to play a part in telling this story.
Well, it takes a Bill Rodman and a Flo Rodman, and it takes LPB, which is why it's so important for you to be a contributing member. We make supporting public television easy for you.
Sustaining membership is an easy, convenient, and affordable way to support the programs you love. Sustaining members make an ongoing monthly contribution from either their credit card or checking account. Just choose the monthly amount you'd like to give. Then call or go online and we'll set it up for you. Your donation will happen automatically each month, so your support will always be current. If you need to stop or want to change the amount of your sustaining membership, just contact us. Monthly contributions begin as low as $5 per month. Call or go online to start your sustaining membership right now.
Bill, plus in addition to that, we have a special offer that matches your gift. Tell us about it.
The Natchitoches Area Convention and Visitors Bureau, is proud to support the programming on LPB and is challenging all viewers to donate tonight, and they will match dollar for dollar the first $1,500 called in during this program only. In effect, this will make your donation worth twice as much to LPB. That's awesome. Together, we can keep LPB strong in Louisiana.
Oh, that is fantastic. And you know, the people who make all this possible are the people who are watching this program by calling in 888-769-5000 or going online. To become a supporting member, it takes money to do these things. It takes money to run the TV station, and that's why we have to come and do this for you periodically, but it gives us the opportunity to have great things like Bill's documentaries. And I believe you know the Gould family, Arlene Gould. She is with the Natchitoches Area Convention and Visitors Bureau. She has a word for us.
Greetings from Natchitoches, Louisiana, where we're celebrating the 95th Natchitoches Christmas. We are also proud to be here tonight to support the No Man's Land documentary, where we're a partner in No Man's Land. The corporate challenge tonight, Natchitoches Convention and Visitors Bureau, is proud to support the programming on LPB, and we're challenging viewers to donate tonight. We will match dollar for dollar the first $1,500 called in during this break only. This will make your donation worth twice as much to LPB. Together we can keep LPB strong in Louisiana. Thank you.
Thank you, Arlene. And we're here with Bill Rodman, the man behind No Man's Land. Bill, what surprised you the most when you were researching this project?
Well, Chuck, you know, it's interesting. We mentioned a little bit previously about how it's fascinating how few people have heard of this story of Louisiana's No Man's Land. And I guess one of the most eye-opening facts that we stumbled upon is that the folks over there in No Man's Land, the western part of the state, we're talking about towns like Logansport, Zwolle, DeRidder, they're not learning anything from this documentary. These are the folks that count their descendants as being from No Man's Land. It is an everyday part of their life. It's in their DNA, this pride, the resilience that their ancestors had so many years ago is very much alive today over there, and that's fascinating.
And the fact is, they're Louisianians in Louisiana and not Texas. That's all gets settled out. I think we have more about that coming up. And you know, LPB is really known for its fantastic raffles. We've got periodically new ones, and we have a new one for you here.
The future of driving is here. LPB's Win the Wheels raffle accelerates into the 21st century with a Tesla Model 3.
Hi, my name's Seth Irby, and I'm a proud board member for the Friends of LPB. Join me in supporting LPB and enter the raffle today for your chance to win a Tesla Model 3.
Enter for your chance to win this hot next-generation electric car. Every dollar raised goes to support public broadcasting and provide educational resources in your local community. Purchase a ticket for $50. Buy two and you'll get the third ticket free. You'll also receive LPB's most popular benefit, LPB Passport, giving you unlimited access to the best of PBS and LPB on demand. Go online to lpb.org/raffle or call 888-769-5000. You are helping sustain LPB for the future, which makes you a winner and possibly the owner of a brand new Tesla.
The raffles, the thank you gifts, the special offers that we have, all to help you support Louisiana Public Broadcasting, LPB. You do it by going to your phone, 888-769-5000. Bill, we have some special offers this program.
Some very nice ones. Here is a $400 special credit card offer. For a pledge of $400 or more on a credit card, you will receive an original pelican painting by local Lake Charles artist Eddie Moorman. It's a 10 by 8 size painting. At $1,200, there's a $1,200 special credit card offer as well. For the first caller of $1,200 or more on a credit card, you will receive a 2-night stay, including a complimentary guided fishing trip for two, along with a round of golf, green fees, and cart included. In addition to these wonderful gifts, you'll receive Visions, LPB's monthly guide, program guide, Louisiana Life magazine, and our popular member benefit LPB Passport.
Oh yeah, love the Passport, and there you saw it, Visions magazine. It's a treasure trove of what's coming up. When you look through here and you see all the musical programs that are on LPB, We have more music on here than I think they have on MTV. You know, they used to have music, but not anymore. And of course, Louisiana Life also comes with this. And this is a fantastic magazine. You ought to write for Louisiana Life, or have you? You're right up their alley. If you like Louisiana Life, you're going to love Bill Rodman stuff and vice versa. Let me talk to you about some of the gifts that we have. For a pledge of $240, that's $20 a month, you're going to receive the No Man's Land combo, which includes the Marshes to Mansions hardcover cookbook and a pair of LPB gumbo mugs. You get the Natchitoches and Louisiana's Timeless Cane River hardcover book by Philip Gould, and the program DVD, all that for just $20 a month as a sustaining member. Or if you pledge $120, you'll receive the Natchitoches and Louisiana's Timeless Cane River hardcover book by Philip Gould. Or for just $6 a month, you can afford that, come on, you'll receive the program DVD of No Man's Land. And send it in, maybe we get Bill to autograph that for you, make it a real treasure. But you know, the real treasure is Louisiana Public Broadcasting, and what it enables artists like Bill to accomplish, to bring to you stories you probably never heard about. Unless you're in no man's land, you didn't know there was a no man's land, or that we had the capital of Texas in Louisiana. Fascinating stuff. Let's get back to the program. Bill, don't give it away. No Man's Land. Keep watching.
And in that space, all kinds of things took place because you have no form of official law or anyone that is answered to. And so what happens then over time is that this becomes a place where, you know, the worst of the worst come.
One of the most popular outlaw legends is the story of John Murrell, the Reverend Devil.
The reason why they called him the Reverend Devil was because his father was a preacher, and he learned the Bible early on. The legend is that he could quote all 10 of the commandments while he was breaking them.
Rumors abound of outlaws who buried their ill-gotten gains in the Kisatchie Forest, close to the caves they hid out in, strategically located near the El Camino Real.
The El Camino Real has long been known as a smuggling route between the French and the Spanish, dating back to almost its very beginnings.
Some legends talk about Spain transporting silver along that highway. Outlaws or bandits would sort of populate those roads because it's where the money was.
There was lots of movement through No Man's Land, of pioneers making their way west along the El Camino Real.
What really was driving the sort of westward expansion of the Americas, this idea that there were silver mines in this region, in New Spain, that promised great wealth.
These settlers became easy prey for outlaws who would rob them and simply vanish into the densely forested surroundings, attesting to the fact
the damn neutral strip is cursed of the devil.
Ferry crossings were another favorite for thieves who would lie in wait.
There are many stories about cattle thieves and rustlers and smugglers crossing the river in one direction, stealing cattle or goods, and then crossing again to escape.
This was the time that lawlessness, you could say either lawlessness occurred or there was no lawlessness at all.
A time that drew pirates, like the infamous Jean Lafitte, who was able to operate right out in the open.
Nobody was going to come here after him because they weren't going to send any militia. They were not going to send any taxmen. So Jean Lafitte, literally, when he came to Southwest Louisiana, he was not a pirate. He was not a privateer. He was essentially an early 19th century version of Amazon. He was actually bringing in goods and supplies. Visit by Jean Lafitte was viewed as a great boon because finally we can get gunpowder, we can get crockery, we can get textiles, we can get pots and pans, we can get guns, we can get this, that, and the other.
except people would have been one of the commodities pirates would traffic.
The neutral strip in terms of African Americans would have been, or African descended people, would have been a place you went through, not that you stayed. Because what happened is if you, let's say you were a free black person traveling through the neutral strip, and for whatever reason nobody knew you, or you didn't have the right papers or whatever, then someone would catch you, take you to Kentucky or Georgia or somewhere else and re-enslave you. So that was not somewhere you wanted to be.
When Jean Lafitte was here, he was legal because there was no law, because this was no man's land, which makes it really unusual in terms of telling history, but there it is. That's the history of Southwest Louisiana.
That's why the outlaw is so important to the neutral strip, right? Because it's more about how people of the neutral strip survived and made a life in a region that was known as a tough place and drew the attention of outlaws.
Before no man's land became known for its lawlessness, there were generations of settlers who had no qualms about fending for themselves.
You had to skin your own skunks and whatever. You had to be independent. You had to be self-sufficient. And many of those pioneers just wanted to be left alone to make a living.
These were not plantation peoples. These were not slave-owning peoples. Just small-scale farmers working 15, 20 acres that could be farmed by the family. And that became the predominant economy throughout what's going to become no man's land.
To the south, raising cattle was becoming a burgeoning industry.
And because of that sort of cowboy culture that you ordinarily associate with the American West of the 1870s is actually practiced in Louisiana 70, 80 years before the trail drives. We have the trail drives here in Louisiana very, very, very early on.
Everything here was about survival.
The contraband trade began out of necessity due to the far eastern position of Los Adias. It was hundreds of miles away from San Antonio. The Spanish soldiers would trade things that they had gathered from throughout Texas.
They also traded Native Americans that they had enslaved.
Samuel de Leon, he was a French soldier at Fort St. Jean-Baptiste, and he bought a Lipan Apache Indian woman named Juana Maria, and he had 3 children with her, and I descend from one of those 3 children.
The people may have been poor in terms of their material culture, but they lived a subsistence, pretty happy way of life, far away from any kind of central control or any kind of central command.
This lack of government drew the Native American Coushatta to no man's land, a people who were looking for a place that offered peace, but most importantly, independence from outsider interference.
It also drew the attention of a variety of other people who were looking for opportunity and a way of life. Joseph Willis is an important figure in the neutral strip. Some people say he was the first Baptist preacher west of the Mississippi River.
Willis was a freedman, the son of an Englishman and a Cherokee slave. He first appears as a Protestant minister in Louisiana in 1798. He was a huge figure in bringing religion to no man's land.
Part of what settled that region were these early churches. They were the key factors of making a place stable, right? And they're basically indicative of how people settled. You form a church and you gather together and you worship, but you rely on each other for support.
We consider like the church is our Hispanic culture. Everything revolving around the Catholic churches, St. Joseph's, St. Anne's, St. Catherine's, that is all part of our culture.
I'm a member of the Choctaw Apache tribe of Ebarb. And our tribe is made up of predominantly Choctaw and Apache Native Americans that were in this area for many hundreds of years before the first Anglo-American settlers came in.
And over time, all the cultures that had settled here, the Spanish, French, the freedmen, Anglo-Americans, and Native American tribes, all blended together to create a new culture unique to southwestern Louisiana. One that had as much to do with their spirit as it did their ethnicity.
The family connections are incredibly strong.
You survived. You got to continuously protect yourself against the elements, against people.
That's a hallmark of the neutral strip, no man's land.
That is one of the things that is the most persistent aspect of the neutral strip mentality, like what neutral strip residents understand about themselves. That in order to survive in this place, especially early on, it took a pretty tough character.
My dad, it was a total fight with him. He was notorious for his fighting in Zwolle, all him and his cousins. But it wasn't that they were fighting against the system. They were just fighting to let people know that they couldn't be pushed over.
I think if you live in a place that had attracted not only outlaws for a time, but also people who were trying to live independently or to live outside of the watchful eyes of a certain group, you had to develop the ability to take care of yourself.
You don't know these outside people, so you don't really want to let them in. And that's the way they were.
And in 1821, the Adams-Onis Treaty was ratified, and Spain abandoned any claim to territory east of the Sabine River. The western boundary of the new state of Louisiana was set at the Sabine River.
I don't think Wilkinson or anybody at the time believed that the neutral strip would last that long, no man's land would last that long.
No man's landers were now Americans.
You just didn't have a line or a fence or a road or anything you could step over and say, okay, I'm in no man's land. It was sort of fluid, very fluid.
But a treaty could not stop what was already in place.
Welcome back. I'm Chuck Perrin, longtime supporter of LPB. You're watching the LPB broadcast premiere of No Man's Land. We know you love learning about history, just like I do, and that's why you're watching LPB right now, and that's why it's all the more important for us to hear from you. When you make a pledge of support to LPB during this program, well, you are casting your vote and telling us that you want to see more quality programs such as this. Programs that you're not going to see anywhere else. You know, we reintroduce you to filmmaker Bill Rodman. We're going to do that in just a minute. But right now, we invite you to call or text GIVE, G-I-V-E, to 888-769-5000. You can go online at lpb.org, or you can simply scan that funny-looking QR code that's on your screen. Do that with your smartphone. And that way you can become a member and renew your membership, or make an additional gift of support, or give the gift of membership to a family member or to a friend. Let me tell you again about the thank you gifts that are available during this program, and they're really, really pretty cool. For a pledge of $240, that's just $20 a month as a sustaining member, you're going to receive the No Man's Land combo, which includes the Marshes to Mansions hardcover book and a pair of LPB gumbo mugs. You get the Natchitoches and Louisiana's Timeless Cane River hardcover book by Philip Gould, and you get this program's DVD. For $120 or a pledge of $10 a month, you'll receive the Natchitoches and Louisiana's Timeless Cane River hardcover book by Philip Gould, or for just $6 a month. How about, $72 if you want to do it all at once? You're going to receive the program DVD. And there are some special credit card offers. These are really great. For a pledge of $400 or more on a credit card, you will receive an original pelican painting by local artist Eddie Moorman, an original pelican painting, size 10 by 8. Or if you want to go $1,200 and you're the first caller with a pledge of $1,200 or more on a credit card, you will receive a 2-night stay, including a complimentary guided fishing trip for 2, along with a round of golf, green fees, and cart included. And I've stayed at Cypress Bend. It's well worth it, folks. And in addition to these wonderful gifts, you'll receive Vision's LPB monthly past program guide. You're going to get Louisiana Life magazine and our popular member benefit, LPB Passport. But mostly what you get is great programming, stuff that you're not going to find anywhere else. Who else but LPB and Bill Rodman would have done No Man's Land and taught us this little-known part of Louisiana history, much less American history. Louisianans don't know much about this, but you're learning it here on LPB. Bill, this is really terrific. I'm a big history buff, so I'm very pleased that you did this. But you've also done some other things up in the Cane River area. What attracted you to that area? You're not from Louisiana originally, are you?
Well, Chuck, no, I'm not. I grew up in the Midwest, and I moved to Baton Rouge over 30 years ago. But I came here working in the news business, storytelling, as we both have quite a bit of experience doing now. But I was always a fan of Charles Kuralt.
Yes.
And Charles Kuralt said that the problem that he saw, one of the problems with America was it was getting homogenized, meaning there wasn't a whole lot of difference between various parts of the country. Well, the first time I rolled into Baton Rouge and started experiencing Louisiana, this is the least homogenized place in the country, and that, of course, is a compliment. Yes. And as a storyteller, I rolled into this dream scenario, and these stories that we can tell, and that as you as viewers can enjoy and on a weeknight evening at home on your television, are stories that are just not found in other parts of the country. We are lucky. This is special.
And that's why LPB is special. And why it's so special and so important for you to contribute. Become a sustaining member. 888-769-5000. We don't get this programming paid for. All these great other great ones like Ken Burns, his documentaries. We have to pay for that programming. And the money for that kind of programming comes from you. So we sure need your support. And when you've pledged during a history program like this, you're telling us you want more of that. And that is absolutely terrific. And we make supporting public television easy for you.
Sustaining membership is an easy, convenient, and affordable way to support the programs you love. Sustaining members make an ongoing monthly contribution from either their credit card or checking account. Just choose the monthly amount you'd like to give. Then call or go online and we'll set it up for you. Your donation will happen automatically each month, so your support will always be current. If you need to stop or want to change the amount of your sustaining membership, just contact us. Monthly contributions begin as low as $5 per month. Call or go online to start your sustaining membership right now.
Thank you so much. We want you to be a sustaining member because it makes all the difference in the world. And especially during this break, during this program, we have a special challenge.
This challenge from the Natchitoches Area Convention and Visitors Bureau, they're proud to support the programming on LPB, and they are challenging all viewers to donate tonight, and they will match dollar for dollar the first $1,500 called in during this program only. In effect, this will make your donation worth twice as much to LPB. That is awesome. Together, we can keep LPB strong in Louisiana.
Absolutely, and of course, you're a regular viewer. You know about the special thank you gifts we have. We have some that are specific to this program. If you call in and make a pledge of $240, that's just $20 a month. $20 a month as a sustaining member. Come on, you can do that. You're going to get all of this. The No Man Land combo, which includes the Marshes to Mansions hardcover book and a pair of LPB gumbo mugs, the Natchitoches and Louisiana's Timeless Cane River hardcover book by Philip Gould, and the program DVD. For $10 a month as a sustaining member or a one-time pledge of $120, you're going to receive the Natchitoches and Louisiana's Timeless Cane River hardcover book by Philip Gould. Or for $6 a month, you can receive the program DVD. But use your credit card, folks, because we got some special credit card offers here. For a pledge of $400 or more on a credit card, you're going to receive an original 8x10 pelican painting by local Lake Charles artist Eddie Mormon. Yes, it's an original. So, I don't know, maybe someday you can come on Antiques Roadshow and get even more for it. For $1,200 special credit card offer, the first caller on a credit card pledging $1,200 or more, you will receive at Cypress Bend Resort a 2-night stay, including a complimentary guided fishing trip for two, along with a round of golf, and it's a nice golf course. They got green fees, card, everything's included into that. And in addition to these wonderful gifts, you'll receive Visions, LPB's monthly program guide, Louisiana Life magazine, and our popular member benefit, LPB Passport. There is just so many reasons to contribute to LPB, and I'll tell you what, Bill's got a good friend of LPB. This is Ms. Gould. She has a message for us.
Greetings from Natchitoches, Louisiana, where we're celebrating the 95th Natchitoches Christmas. We are also proud to be here tonight to support the No Man's Land documentary, where we're a partner in No Man's Land. The corporate challenge tonight, Natchitoches Convention and Visitors Bureau is proud to support the programming on LPB, and we're challenging viewers to donate tonight. We will match dollar for dollar the first $1,500 called in during this break only. This will make your donation worth twice as much to LPB. Together we can keep LPB strong in Louisiana. Thank you.
Thank you, Arlene. Arlene Gould with the Natchitoches Convention and Visitors Bureau. Bill, I know that to do the kinds of programs that you do are so special, you need the support of LPB, but you also need the support of the local people in the area, and I bet they were great to you. You can tell. They like you.
They certainly were and are, Chuck, for sure.
So what do you think you could do this without, or what did they bring local knowledge that you didn't get from your research books?
Well, one of the interesting aspects of this No Man's Land story is that you can talk to every historian in the world, but the fact that this story, that this identity is still alive in those communities, those Western Louisiana communities, is just absolutely amazing. No Man's Landers are alive and well in the western part of the state. That resilience, that independence, and it's really neat to really get the breadth of the history of this story and to realize the effect that it still has on these people's everyday lives.
And what I like so much about a program like the kinds of programs that you do is that this isn't just something academic out of a book. You personalize it with these people. They make the difference.
And that's storytelling. People want to meet people. Viewers want to meet people and have a sense of meeting these folks. And that's to me is the key of a special story.
Have they given you the key to No Man's Land yet? Because I think you deserve it. You deserve LPB. It's so important to the culture of Louisiana and everything that is important in our lives with things that you don't get anywhere else, like programs like this. And we have many ways of saying thank you. We've told you about the thank you gifts, but we also have started doing these wonderful raffles, fantastic raffles, and there's always a new one.
The future of driving is here. LPB's Win the Wheels raffle accelerates into the 21st century with a Tesla Model 3.
Hi, I'm Trisha Johnson, and I'm the winner of the 2021 Win the Wheels raffle.
Enter for your chance to win this hot next-generation electric car. Every dollar raised goes to support public broadcasting and provide educational resources in your local community. Purchase a ticket for $50. Buy 2 and you'll get the third ticket free. You'll also receive LPB's most popular benefit, LPB Passport, giving you unlimited access to the best of PBS and LPB on demand. Go online to lpb.org/raffle or call 888-769-5000.
Can't win if you don't enter. I love my new Tesla. Thank you, friends of LPB.
You are helping sustain LPB for the future, which makes you a winner and possibly the owner of a brand new Tesla.
Tesla, that'd be nice.
Yeah, it would be nice.
Bill, it's nice to have you here. It's nice to see the kinds of work that you've been doing. Thank you so much for this fantastic documentary and for the Cane River things that you've done. And your wife, Flo. Let's not forget Flo. She's an important part of this too. But are we going to be seeing more from Bill Rodman in the future?
Oh, definitely, Chuck. One of my dreams is to kind of hit the road, if you will, and
you want to be your own Charles Curral.
Well, you know,
for Louisiana.
I kind of want to make it my own, but yeah, in a way, you know, he had a good gig. But I just love hitting the small towns and telling the small town stories.
Well, thank you for doing what you do, and keep doing it. And we'll keep doing it right here in LPB. Thank you.
With the border question settled between Spain and Louisiana, the anarchy prevalent throughout no man's land had to end. And in 1822, Fort Jessup was established. Situated on the El Camino Real, 15 miles from Natchitoches and a day's march from the Sabine, it functioned as the central stronghold of the new frontier, restoring law and order to the region. Then, in 1830, a contingent of Fort Jessup soldiers was hurriedly dispatched to Lake Charles.
It was decided by the U.S. government that they need to plant the flag somewhere in South Louisiana as quickly as possible.
The pirating that had flourished along the winding Calcasieu River during no man's land persisted. Cantonment Atkinson was erected, the illicit activities were contained, and the company returned to its home base. The troops at Fort Jessup valiantly fulfilled their mission, serving until the threat at the border no longer existed with the annexation of Texas in 1846. With the signing of the Adams-Onis Treaty, no man's land now becomes part of Louisiana, and the land is turned over to the United States.
And what begins is a process of recognizing that people were there and that people had some semblance of a claim to the land.
The Rio Hondo Land Claims Commission of 1824 sets up a 4-tier system to determine ownership. The first and second tier claims were well-established landholdings that were awarded ownership. The fourth class claims were thrown out, held to be groundless.
Then there's a large third tier. These were people eking out a living in the woods of the Kisatchie Hills, on the floodplain of the Calcasieu or the Sabine Rivers down towards the south. These were people who were living very hard lives. This is how you get your first real sense of who was there.
In our journey for federal recognition, I served as the tribal genealogist for the Choctaw Apache tribe of Ebarb. One remarkable fact about the tribe is that all of its members can trace at least one ancestor, if not more than one, to the original land grant.
You're dealing with a lot of people that their ancestors have been there now going on 200 and actually going on close to 250 years.
Francisco Carmona was a Native American who was born at Los Adias, served the Spanish crown as a soldier at the Alamo. For his military service to the Spanish crown, he was given a land grant, and his land was located in Sabine Parish, and then became a no-man lander, and then eventually became an American before his death.
And so, it was through the Rio Hondo land claims the first legal no man's landers were officially recognized. Despite the well-established borders of today, there's still a unique political, economic, and cultural interconnectedness that exists in no man's land. The sturdy and diverse settlers who weathered both prosperity and haplessness with equal grace are still here. They live on in the faces, the families, and the myths and legends of today. This inherited strength, independence, and resilience is a proud no man's land legacy. Though their ancestors faced thieves and bandits, as well as the complete lack of government and sovereignty,
they strive to have that communal power, and that's how they did it. Not with a gun, not with a knife. They educated their children to the point to where they could have positions to help them strive to get what they wanted.
Is it any wonder no man's landers still look to themselves and each other in times of difficulty and disaster?
Because they can't count on government coming in and bailing them out. This is part of what makes no man's land still live.
They were resilient enough to survive to do all of this, and they're still doing it.
No Man's Land was brought to you by America's Byways, gateways to adventure, where no two experiences are the same. The National Scenic Byways program invites you to come closer to America's heart. By the Louisiana Office of Tourism, Louisiana, feed your soul. And by Louisiana's Myths and Legends Byway.